Borrowers have to start repaying their student loans this month, but the Biden administration has some relief for some 125,000 of them after the president's executive order nixing all student debt was struck down. Here's President Biden's announcement yesterday. Take a look.
Today, I'm announcing my administration has approved an additional $9 billion in relief for 125,000 borrowers in just the past few weeks under that program. With the latest debt cancellation, in total, my administration has canceled $127 billion in student debts for nearly 3.6 million Americans. This kind of relief is life-changing for individuals and their families, but it's good for our economy as a whole as well. By freeing millions of Americans from the crushing burden of student debt, it means they can go and get their lives in order. They can think about buying a house, they can start a business, they can be starting a family. This matters.
MSNBC's Mehdi Hasan weighed in on Biden's latest effort to ameliorate in some incrementalist way the student debt burden that's facing 44 million Americans, posting on X, quote, "It's not enough, but it's something, and it's much more than anything the other side are offering." That's one way to frame a policy. Opponents of student debt cancellation balk at the idea of footing the bill of others' choice to take out loans to pay for college, unfairly benefiting college graduates at the taxpayers' expense. So Joe Biden has been doing this really interesting thing where he is hoping to memory hole what he promised Americans. Regardless of if you agree with the policy, the fact is, I didn't put these words in his mouth. Joe Biden made a choice to tell people, both when he was running for office and then conveniently right before midterms, that he promised to cancel $10,000 to $20,000 of student debt for 44 million borrowers who made under $125,000 a year. He ran on that promise. He also additionally, this is something they really hope to memory hole, promised to cancel all student debt for graduates of historically black colleges and universities. It will come as no surprise to anybody watching, especially if you are a student debtor yourself, that none of that happened. Many people will say, well, it's not his fault. The Supreme Court stopped the policy, but for many reasons that I've discussed ad nauseum on this show, he had a choice to, one, choose better legal footing for the policy using the Higher Education Act, which was quite literally designed for this purpose, as opposed to the HERO Act, which hinged it to the COVID emergency. And more importantly, he could have just done it by executive order on day one in office, at which point there would not have been the opportunity for people to bring these lawsuits that enjoined the process of canceling the student debt, because there was this when he means tested the program, it meant that people had to fill out a form, which then gave people an opening to sue. If you had just done it and then maybe prevented people from having windfalls by raising taxes on the rich, something that needed to be done anyway, then you can make sure that nobody who's rich is unfairly benefiting from this policy. And the third thing that he is fully and solely responsible for is turning on the payments again. He could have continued the moratorium. If his argument is, it's not my fault, it's the Supreme Court, we're still trying to fight it, then why would you end the moratorium if you think ultimately you have a good chance of being successful? Why would you have people paying in the interim when the economy is what it is and during an election year?
I don't think, taking Joe Biden sort of out of the equation and putting all the people advising him and actually making policy in the White House in the seat, the Biden administration, I don't think ever thought this was actually going to work. I think it was pretty clear in 2020 that this was a political football trying to get young people to turn out and vote. And you saw that in their work with TikTok influencers and everyone else. Proving yet again that this was solely a political issue for the Biden administration was them bringing it up, as you mentioned, right ahead of the midterms and making this promise that basically if you keep me in office and you keep me and my party in power, we will make sure that this gets done. I don't believe that they ever thought that was actually possible. Whatever policy they hinged it on, whatever U.S. code they tried to use to get this done, I don't think they ever actually thought it would work. Because if you look at the track record of this White House, it has been one unconstitutional action after another. Whether it is the eviction moratorium or the student loan forgiveness or the COVID mask mandate and all of these other things, his energy rule, trying to use the EPA to get rid of coal basically completely overnight. All of these things the Biden administration has done to try to give the appearance, and I think this might actually be something you're going to agree with. The Biden administration has done all of this to give the appearance as though they're acting and governing as leftists and as progressives and doing these things like waging war against climate change and helping people basically have their entire debt forgiven even though they knowingly took out a student loan. All of these things was meant to give that appearance in order to make sure that the progressive base and especially young people stayed on Democrats' side and voted for that party. And I don't think they ever thought that any of this was actually going to work, because they keep pursuing these policies knowing that they're going to get struck down, but knowing that they have that window of time from the time they introduce the policy until the court has a time to take a look at it and hand down an opinion. They have that much time to make their point, and again, memory hole it once it's failed.
My edit is only that I don't think it's that they didn't think they could, is that they ensured that they couldn't. They designed their efforts so that they would be unsuccessful, so that they could weaponize them in the ways that you've described. That's the only thing, because I think it is possible to do all of these things. We saw, for example, in Libby, Montana, when there was a toxic disaster, the government knows it can step in and give everybody in a town health insurance. It could do that in East Palestine. It could do a lot of things by executive order, demonstrated by the fact that it has. The pennies that Joe Biden is bragging embarrassingly about canceling. What is it, 125,000 debtors? 125,000? I'm not so good at math, Spencer, but what percentage of 44 million is 125,000?
I'm also not good enough.
It's less than 1%.
It's not much. It's not much. And
so that's what he's bragging about giving to debtors.
He wants his dues.
Yeah, and I just want to make it really clear. If you have other priorities and you want to vote for the Democratic Party, you can do that. Obviously, you can do that. But you should not do so believing a thing that's coming out of Joe Biden's mouth. And you should also wonder what accountability mechanisms exist for you holding politicians accountable to their campaign promises. If people like Mehdi Hassan, who's supposed to be a member of the Fourth Estate, challenging power and protecting your interests, are instead running cover for the Biden administration, hopping on the internet to say, oh, well, it's not as much as we thought we were going to get, but it's something and it's better than Donald Trump. Is that the role of the media?
It seems like it has been, because they are taking absolutely everything that this White House puts out and running laps and laps and laps of it, even though, again, it's one of these things where just because Joe Biden does it, it seems that every single policy that he's done that has been delivering on a key promise that he made has ended up being struck down by the Supreme Court.
I'll tell you what he's doing just fine, building a wall on the southern border.
That is true. Suddenly he's decided that walls do work. But I think, as a conservative on this, you can probably guess that my opinion is that these are student loans that were taken out by people who were generally adults. Everybody signed their MPN, Master Promissory Note, saying, I am taking out these loans. Now, that is true in my mind, and I think generally, like, everybody who has a student loan had to do that. But that just addressing how many people did that does not fix the problem that is government intervention in education has been a disaster in this country, not just in K through 12, but specifically in higher education. There's a survey recently that in the last decade, enrollment in higher education went down by 2.9 million students, and revenue at schools went up by more than $15 billion. And that speaks to the problem that is the federal government subsidizing these educations. And it's a basic, again, I'm not that great at math, but a basic algebraic formula where you have the cost of an education is X, and the cost of, and what the federal government will give to a student is Y. And universities know that they can charge X plus Y because once they have educated the student and they know how much the government will give them, that's how much the tuition is. And you have students coming out the other side who are not able to get jobs because they're getting degrees in things that don't matter. This is like the stereotypical conservative talking point, but this whole problem is that education has become so much more than teaching people, how to build a good life, how to market yourself, how to manage your finances, how to do all these things. It has not done that, and it has not set young people, specifically the last generation and a half, up for success. And it's predominantly the cost of this is because the federal government got involved in the first place.
I strongly agree that Reagan shouldn't have gotten involved in government. Here's what happened. When he was, during his campaign in 1966 to be governor of California, he started publicly criticizing the University of California system back then, which was the crown jewel of American public education, basically a free and very high quality educational opportunity. But young people there were getting involved in political movements that Reagan didn't agree with. So he chose to hamstring their ability to get an education to try to advance his own political agenda, very much injecting both the federal, at that time, the state government, but later the federal government into the ability of people to get their education on a local level. He referred to student protesters as brats, freaks, and cowardly fascists. Sorry, Mom and Dad, I'm a fascist now because I went to a UC school. Reagan's education advisor told him, quote, "We are in danger of producing an educated proletariat." Oh no, we don't want that, because then they wouldn't vote Republican anymore. That's dynamite. We have to be selective on who we allow to go through higher education. This is Reagan's education advisor, Roger A. Freeman. And that belief has gone on to shape higher education. Before Reagan became governor, tuition was free for California residents. However, because he viewed the system as disruptive, he cut state funding to public universities by 20%, arguing, as you just did, that taxpayers should not subsidize colleges. He called it intellectual curiosity. Now we live in a world where, because of the way that we've chosen to guarantee these federal loans, I agree, it has caused there to be a arms race in terms of raising tuitions. But the answer to that is to undo Reagan's damage and to fully fund public education. This was part of Bernie's plan. Bernie's plan to cancel all student debt was not vulnerable to the same criticisms that Biden's asinine, backward plan is vulnerable, because he doesn't actually want to fix the problem. He wanted just to coerce voters to vote for him. Bernie's plan got to the root causes and said, we're going to do this one-time debt jubilee, and we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition free, so that the ability to go to college, which really does, you're right, get you a leg up in the world, rightly or wrongly. We have a two-tiered system of employment in this country, where if you go and get a college degree, your ability to earn a higher income is significantly greater. And so we have to ask ourselves as a society, do we want only parents of rich children? We don't want children who are, children of rich parents to have the ability to get that advantage? Do we want a poor kid to have to pay more for their college than a rich kid pays, because they have to pay an 8% interest rate over the next 30, 40 years of their life to pay back that loan? Or do we want everyone to have an equal opportunity to get the benefits that we all know exist from going to college or to a trade school? And remember, trade schools are a part of this, and the average trade school debt is $10,000. All of those people who have debt from trade school would have had all of their debt erased if this policy had actually gone through. So I agree with you that there need to be substantive reforms, but it's not coming from Republicans. It's not coming from Joe Biden. And I think conservatives who say, well, just don't go to college, as they sit on their Harvard and Yale degrees, the way that the Ron DeSantis's and all of them have, and they'll send their kids to their school, and their kids are going to get in through legacy admissions. 30-odd% of Harvard is a legacy, as we were talking about affirmative action. Only 10% of Harvard has ever been black, but 30-odd% has been legacy. They're climbing up a ladder and locking it behind you and weaponizing the interests of working class people to justify why they get to keep all the privileges in American society to themselves. So I don't know how to solve the problem now, but the problem is going to persist. And complaining about the unfairness of student debt, while millionaires like Kanye West and what's his name, the son-in-law, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, get PPP loans, and we get housing breaks for if I own $1 million home, if I own a $750,000 home, they just changed it, so it's not quite $1 million. If I own a $750,000 home, I get to write off all of that interest. But if I have a $75,000 student loan and make more than $60,000 a year, I can write off zero of it. And if I make less than $60,000 a year, I can write off a measly $2,000 worth of that interest. My first year paying back my student debt, and I'm a lucky one who could afford it. And this is not my sob story about me. But other people are in my situation who don't have the ability to pay. I paid $18,000 of interest alone that first year, and $5,000 of principal. I mean, the system is totally broken, like you were saying. I'm glad you brought up UC schools, because you were talking about also this idea that conservatives don't want to go to these institutions. My previous job before I was at Town Hall was solely based on getting conservatives into liberal, you should go. If you don't want them to be liberal, you should go.
And it was one of the most important things, because again, if you hand over, in the eyes of the conservative side of this, if you hand over these institutions to the leftists, then what hope does anybody have for the next generation? And we actually had to, in my previous job, sue UC Berkeley in order to get them to change their policies that was prohibiting speakers of conservative ideology from appearing on that campus.
I believe everyone should be able to talk.
It is absolutely where these battles should be playing out, battles of ideas, and not battles, as happened at UC Berkeley, of burning down the Amazon bookstore, of throwing, I almost got hit with a trash can when I was there, for crying out loud. Like, it's just, that should not be higher education. But why is the government subsidizing this, and why are people paying as much as they are for institutions like UC Berkeley, where somebody, because they disagree with this, I would say it was a minority of the students on that campus, should be treated as though they are, illegal and their presence is unlawful on that campus? It just makes no sense.
Well, and in Florida, you've got Christopher Rufo, qualifications aside, being put to administer a college, half the faculty has evacuated. They canceled African American studies, not because of a qualitative evaluation of the program, but because they just don't believe that there's value in teaching African American studies. So yes, we're having these battles play out in ways that I think in the Florida case are very explicitly because the political ideology of the governor of the state who's reaching in and letting his political agenda set an academic agenda for a school. So I think that we can have conversations about how these places become politically independent and protected from the reach of the government. I don't think they should be playing these funding games where they say we're only going to fund you if you have the people that we like. There has to be some protections one way or the other, whether they're right or left leaning, for educational institutions to make decisions in the interest of the education of the people who are going there. That's the whole point of tenure, right? That's the idea of some of these policies, to insulate them from those kinds of political whims. And as we've seen across the country, Republicans are very adept at affecting the leaning of school boards. If you want to get involved, you can get involved and have a lot of impact on the kind of education that gets taught. But those are conversations that should be happening out. That assumes you don't get arrested
for speaking out at a school board meeting.
Those are conversations that should be happening at a local level. And it started at a federal level because largely of the interference of people like Ronald Reagan and people like Joe Biden, who specifically chose to stigmatize student debt different than all other kinds of debt because it's non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. He did that during a time he was known as a senator from MBNA, which is now Bank of America, because it's headquartered in Delaware, and that's where his allegiances lie. There's a big club, and you're not in it. So remember, when you're complaining about the way that things are, that you're complaining about the right person, and that you're not just complaining about the status quo, but that you're actively advocating for policies that are actually going to improve your life and the lives of your children. That's all I have to say about that.
Good word.
All right, stick around. More Rising right after this.